Buongiorno.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome. My name is Agostino Miozzo. I am the Director General of the Department of Civil Protection, and today I am glad to be the Master of Ceremony of this forum, the beginning of this important event that opens the 2018 Forum for the Disaster Risk Reduction. During the opening of this forum, we are glad to have here our Prime Minister, Mr. Giuseppe Conte. I immediately leave the floor to him, and I really thank him for being here. Miss Mizutori, authorities, ladies and gentlemen, I am glad to give my contribution to this international forum hosted here in Rome. We really believe, our government believes, that the topics which will be discussed during these days are absolutely central for our countries. Risk reduction has become, during the last few years, not only an urgent topic for the scientific community, but also fundamental for all governments, locally and globally. Italy, as you know, has always been a laboratory for every kind of risk. We are the European country with the highest number of active volcanoes. Many of them are fortunately dormant, at least temporarily. The entire peninsula is full of seismogenic faults underground, which can provoke earthquakes and serious damages to our national heritage. Our buildings, monuments, and infrastructures are vulnerable, extremely vulnerable, as they were built in times when anti-seismic technologies were unknown. Moreover, there is a high incidence of landfalls in hills and mountains, which are not covered in vegetation anymore, especially in areas that haven't undergone ordinary maintenance. The hydrologic risk in our country is high. We already experienced sudden floods in the past. During the last few weeks, we've experienced extreme weather events in Italy, especially in 11 regions. It caused 29 casualties and plus 4 victims at the beginning of October, and damages to our lands and populations. It is not the first time, though, that our country is affected by such phenomena that provoke devastation, casualties, and thousands of affected people. At the same time, high temperatures and a lack of rainfall irresponsible and criminal behaviors can be just as prejudicial, provoking forest fires and increasingly serious damages, even if we do our best to avoid and control them with all our forces. However, risks are not only natural, but also anthropic, caused by human. We have new kinds of risks, and we must take them into account. In particular, I'm talking about the deterioration of materials used for buildings in the past. In particular, I'm talking about the Morandi Bridge in Genoa. 3 months ago, 43 people died during this event, and many people had to leave their homes. It caused huge damages to the entire city of Genoa. I experienced this tragedy myself, and our government worked hard to handle this emergency situation, to help the people and the regions. From an economic point of view, the Genoa Decree established 700 million allocated, and we will increase this amount in the future. We carried out many activities in the city, supporting companies. We invested in public transport, local public transport. We supported freelancers and companies that are located in the red zone. They are entitled to a funding of 200,000 euros because of a possible decrease in turnover. Another activity was contracts in public institutions to increase the number of staff to handle this emergency situation. As for the extreme weather events of the past few weeks, we established the state of emergency for 11 regions. We allocated 53.5 million euros for the first interventions. 200 million euros are coming. A few days ago, the chief of the Department of Civil Protection, Mr. Angelo Borrelli, approved the first activities for emergency and appointed the first commissioners. They will draft a plan of emergency interventions to help the population, to remove dangerous zones, and to rebuild infrastructures and networks, removal of debris, and implementation of measures, administrative measures in the areas. Many more activities will be carried out to support the population and the productive activities affected by such extreme weather events. Moreover, as Mr. Costa, our Minister for the Environment, said, we've given to our regions more than 6 billion euros, in particular 900 million euros for 3 years, to fight hydrogeologic disaster. These are funding for development and cohesion. This funding that the country gives to regions to face the consequences of these events has been rated positive by Moody's. They underlined that prevention measures are not high. More than 7,200 municipalities, a high percentage of our municipalities, are exposed to a medium-high risk of landfalls and floods. We always keep an eye on such data, and we will prevent such phenomena as best as we can. we are carrying out support measures, but the last events proved that we have to change our approach in this field. Prevention must be, today more than ever, the key word for the next intervention policies. During the last few days, I launched a work table for a national plan for security against hydrogeologic risk for Italy. They are drafting initiatives from a structural point of view, a comprehensive approach of initiatives in order to monitor risks. Such initiatives will involve regions, local authorities, and civil protection, of course. This is the first step to change the approach I was talking about earlier, aiming at prevention and at coordination of intervention, because, as you know, in complex structures there are several stakeholders. There will be an extraordinary plan in this national plan for security and an extraordinary plan for investment that this government is carrying out. I'm talking about reforms and interventions to renovate our infrastructures, material and immaterial infrastructures. Italy, since the 1980s, has a civil protection system with research centers, universities, and all human resources available to face the risks, to reduce their impact, to face as quick as possible emergency situations. In 1982, the Department of Civil Protection was created. And in 1992, with the law 225, the National Service of Civil Protection was created. Our men of civil protection have always been fundamental to face the catastrophes that affected Italy. They coordinated the aid, they helped the affected population. So today I would really, really like to thank them on behalf of Italy. This government is aware that it is fundamental to raise awareness among population about the risks and their impact. I will explain 3 new kinds of intervention that will be coordinated in the plan, the National Plan for Security. First of all, the first agreement is with the Ministry of the Environment. It will create a new structure for the optimization of available resources to reduce risks, in particular hydrogeologic risks. Through the Universal Civil Service, at the moment there are several initiatives under examination in order to involve thousands of European and Italian youths, in order to raise awareness in the population about the civil protection plans, working with regional and local authorities in our country. Finally, the third initiative is being carried out by the Ministry of Education and the Department of Civil Protection. This initiative aims at teaching in schools how to face the risks of our country in order to be as safe as possible in every degree of education. We must really bear in mind that no government has the capacity and resources on its own to face the consequences of problems that are global. For this reason, Italy has always believed in the strategy of the Sendai framework by the Office of the United Nations to Reduce Risk, and my presence here today proves that this government really believes in this strategy. We believe that we must really make an effort, we must collaborate at European and international level to fulfill its objectives. Collaboration, I would really like to stress this, is fundamental to protect the life of our citizens and the environment. We must exchange best practices, experiences, and knowledge. I hope that, thanks to your efforts and participation, the work of these 2 days will help us elaborate a common strategy against natural and anthropic risks, especially the ones connected to climate change. I will conclude my intervention by thanking, on behalf of all the present, the many people that during the last few months have worked hard to organize this forum. In particular, I would like to thank the Chief of Civil Protection, Mr. Angelo Borrelli, and all the people that in the Civil Protection Department worked for this, especially our volunteers. I wish you well in the task ahead.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words for the men and women of the Department of Civil Protection. I'm sure we can share these words with all our colleagues of the civil protection of other countries, who have many representatives here. Your description is perfect to start the works of this forum. And now I would like to invite the special representative for the General Secretariat of the United Nations, Miss Mami Mizutori. I leave the floor to her.
Your Excellency, President Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, Your Excellency, Deputy Minister of Emergency Situations, Ara Nazaryan of the Republic of Armenia, Mr. Carlo Robiglio, Vice President of Confindustria, representatives of member states, intergovernmental organizations, and stakeholder groups, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a tremendous honor for me to be here today to address you at this opening ceremony of the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction. As Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the President, Prime Minister, and Government of Italy for their organization and hosting of this most important event, which brings together representatives from 55 countries. President Conte has demonstrated strong political commitment and leadership on building resilience to disaster risks by convening and hosting this forum, and we have just learned of many more initiatives to come. I extend a warm welcome to everyone, but in particular to the representatives from Central Asia and South Caucasus who, like myself, are attending the European Forum for the first time. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the people and government of Italy for the tragic loss of lives which we have observed in recent weeks as a result of extreme weather events. Alongside the devastating loss of loved ones, communities across the country are struggling even now to build back better in the wake of large economic losses and damages to the environmental and critical infrastructure. The scenes we have seen unfold in Italy this month are yet another challenge in the story of the impact of climate change and extreme weather events, which we are seeing, unfortunately, everywhere in Europe now. Coldietri, the Association of Italian Agricultural Companies, has stated that the November storms have destroyed 14 million trees, and it could take a century to repair the damage. The governor of Veneto, Mr. Luca Zaia, said that the region's storm damage amounted to at least 1 billion euros. The storms have also brought into sharp focus the ongoing issue of how to protect the rich cultural heritage of Venice from rising sea levels and extreme weather events. Protecting cultural heritage means preserving our own history and social identity, and it is part of our disaster risk reduction agenda that Italy and Europe have strongly embraced. This summer, no matter where we were, we could not miss news of disasters caused by extreme weather events. Europe was no exception, where the threat of climate change was further underlined by unprecedented wildfires. A state of emergency was declared in Greece as huge forest fires killed 74 people. Record high temperatures and weeks of drought contributed to several major wildfires across Sweden. Over the last 20 years, Italy, France, and Germany have featured in the top 10 countries in the world for absolute amount of economic losses by disasters, while countries such as Georgia and Tajikistan appear on the list of countries which have suffered the most in terms of losses as of the percentage of their GDP. Therefore, it does not come as any surprise that Europe is leading the world in terms of its ambitions to implement both the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Together, these initiatives will make a significant contribution towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Over the course of today and tomorrow, we will hear from ministers, high-level officials, and experts about the range of efforts underway across Europe and Central Asia to achieve coherence between the disaster risk and climate change agendas. The EU has a 5-year plan to guide the implementation of the Sendai Framework in EU policies. The rubber is also starting to hit the road at national levels as an increasing number of countries act on their commitment to implement the Sendai Framework, particularly what is called Target E, which is to have a substantial number of countries to have both national and local disaster risk strategies by the year 2020. There are many examples in Europe with 16 countries that already have national disaster risk reduction strategies and many more in development. Countries including Norway, Ireland, and the UK have delivered strategies at both the national and many at the local level. A critical element in getting these strategies right is understanding how data can help to refine a country's risk profile and informed disaster risk management policy. Disaster loss database now exists in 60% of countries in Europe, and 32 countries have enacted legislation on disaster risk reduction in the context of the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. This is the first European forum to take place since the launch of the Sendai Framework, in Sendai Framework Monitor in March this year. So far, also 60% of countries in the region have started to submit their data to the system. I hope that the next 2 days will encourage many more governments to follow suit. Earlier this week, I spoke at a high-level event on sustainable finance hosted by the European Parliament. It is greatly encouraging to see that the European Union and many countries in the region forging ahead and taking action on sustainable finance, including innovative public-private partnerships and strong measures on risk disclosure. There is a clear recognition that long-term investment decisions require adequate disclosure about long-term sustainability risks. This will lead to strengthened risk governance and a key awareness of exposure to climate change, extreme weather events, and other natural hazards. It should also trigger much greater engagement of the private sector in disaster risk management, not just in Europe, but across the world. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has often drawn attention to 3 relevant points in this regard. Firstly, in most economies, the private sector is responsible for 70 to 85% of investment in critical infrastructure. Both regulators and investors are increasingly demanding that businesses disclose their hidden risks, including disaster risks. Secondly, every euro invested in prevention and disaster risk reduction, depending on the scenario, can lead to savings of up to 15 euros and more, avoiding economic losses. And thirdly, currently, nearly 87% of disaster-related spending on ODA goes into emergency response, reconstruction, and rehabilitation, which is of course very important, but only 13% goes towards managing the risks before disaster hits. This imbalance, I believe, must be corrected if we are to achieve the paradigm shift which was agreed at Sendai in 2015, that we have to move from managing disasters to managing disaster risks. We have to understand what are the drivers of disaster, and these are poverty, unplanned urbanization, unplanned land use, environmental degradation, and of course, climate change. I am confident that developments in sustainable finance will pave the way for change, not just in Europe, but beyond. We saw record-level direct losses of 300 billion euro last year from disasters around the world. And once again, significantly, less than half the losses were covered by risk transfer solutions, which means they were uninsured. This illustrates the enormous economic challenges that people, companies, and public institutions face in tackling the consequence of disasters. I take note that the high-level communiqué issued in Istanbul at the 2017 European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction highlighted the importance of the work underway in Europe to integrate sustainable finance with the disaster risk reduction and the climate change agenda. I am also happy to see that the first plenary session following this opening ceremony is focusing on making the economic case for disaster risk reduction and sustainable financing. Finally, I would like to close by reminding all of us that the Sendai Framework urges us to reduce disaster risk by ensuring that we adopt an inclusive, all-of-society approach to disaster risk management. We need to hear the voices of those who suffer most in such events. These are people who are living with disability, women, children, elderly people. We also must understand that and remind ourselves that the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is a unique agreement in which primarily the governments have the responsibility to implement it, but it is a shared responsibilities amongst all the stakeholders, including the private sector, the civil society, the individuals. So we are here on the same boat together. I look forward to meeting many of you who have gathered, over 800 people, to Rome to attend this conference over the next 2 days. And I am confident that we will have fruitful discussion around all the actions that we need to come out from the Sendai Framework. Thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mizutori, for your kind words and for your wishes for a fruitful work. We will have an intense forum. Now I am glad to leave the floor to the Vice Minister, Deputy Minister for Situation Emergency in Armenia, Mr. Ara Nazaryan. He will talk about the sub-regional platform for disaster risk reduction that took place in Yerevan on the 26th and 27th of June under the Armenian presidency. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. Prime Minister, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and privilege to have this opportunity to participate in the opening ceremony and deliver a speech on behalf of the government of Armenia from this high-level panel. But first, I would like to congratulate UNISDR and the government of Italy for hosting this great event. The European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction is an excellent platform for bringing together all members of the wider European family committed to the global agenda of the disaster risk reduction. We hope that the liberation of this forum will contribute to identifying new platforms and channels for partnership to leverage recent achievements in the progress of Sendai Framework implementation toward the greater social impact and enhanced sustainable development. 5 months ago, on June 26-27, Armenia hosted the sub-regional platform for Central Asia and South Caucasus for disaster risk reduction, which brought together around 200 people representing the member states of the regional platform and international expert community. Among other priorities, the platform tackled issues related to the economy of disasters, promoting effective public-private partnership for risk-sensitive investments, the importance of an all-of-society approach in all DRR activities, and risk-informed decisions for urban and infrastructure development. The sub-regional platform served as an integrated forum to address these and many other issues with peer countries of the region through cross-border leadership and solutions that ultimately can benefit the people. Partnership was formed or strengthened, critical knowledge was shared, actions were synchronized, to promote sustainable and resilient development in the region. At the end of the platform, the Central Asia and South Caucasus countries reiterated their commitments and summarized the outcomes in Yerevan Declaration building on the 2016 Dushanbe Declaration on Disaster Risk Reduction for Resilience Building and its plan of action. Among other things, the document acknowledged existing challenges the countries face, including the rising risk of economic losses due to urbanization and concentration of critical infrastructure, the risk of severe damage to infrastructure, livelihood, and ecosystems, which are key pillars of growth and development due to the natural and man-made disaster. In order to overcome these challenges and being mindful of the need to avoid the creation of future risks and the importance of engagement with the local governments, the countries emphasized the strong value of regional cooperation through data sharing, capacity building, localization and dissemination of the best practices in disaster risk identification, assessment, and modeling its use in DRR education and public awareness raising. Underlining the importance of existing the best technical expertise. Reaffirming their determination to implement the Sendai framework with a focus on reaching the target E by 2020. Called for the establishment and strengthening of the respective national platforms involving all stakeholders, including women, people with disabilities, children, and youth. Excellencies, Armenia is a landlocked and disaster-prone developing country with middle income, which requires prioritization of climate change and disaster risk reduction strategies. Last year, Armenia adopted its national disaster risk reduction strategy, translating the commitments of the Sendai framework and the relevant SDGs into tangible measures for sustainable, risk-informed, disaster-resilient sectoral development with a strong emphasis on the people-centered and all-inclusive approaches at all levels. Armenia stands ready to offer a platform for regional dialogue and to continue to contribute the exchange and cooperation for better integration of disaster risk reduction into development policies and has potential of becoming a reference model for the best practice in the implementation of the Sendai framework alongside with the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. The relevance of international and transboundary cooperation cannot be overemphasized. The excellent cooperation that Armenia is currently enjoying with international organizations, including UNDP, OCHA, UNICEF, World Bank, JICA, DG ECHO, and partners from various DRR national platforms, is promoting the culture of resilience and ensuring the further economic growth in the broader context of global and regional peace and security. In this regard, I would like to extol Her Excellency Ms. Mami Mizutori and her team for invaluable leadership and guidance and all the work to consolidate efforts and build coherence and synergy towards successful implementation of the ambitious agenda on disaster risk reduction. Concluding my remarks, I would like to thank all partner countries of Central Asia and South Caucasus sub-regional platforms on behalf of the government of Armenia for the vote of confidence and support to present the outcomes of Yerevan Declaration to the European Forum today and get global platform for DRR in Geneva in 2019 and I wish all participants successful and fruitful deliberation during this forum. Thank you for attention.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Nazaryan, for your presentation, for your intervention. Now I have the honor to leave the floor to Mr. Carlo Robiglio, that is hosting us in this wonderful location, and all the other locations that will be involved in the works of this forum. Thank you. Dear authorities, ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge pride for me to be able to host in the Confindustria headquarters the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction of 2018. I would like to extend my greetings and my thank you to Ms. Mami Mizutori, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is for us a great pride to have today in the home of Italian enterprises the President of the Council of Ministers, Mr. Giuseppe Conte. It is a pleasure for me, and I also extend my thank you to Minister Ara Nazaryan, Deputy Minister of Emergency Situation, and finally, thank you to the Chief Department of the Civil Protection of the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, Mr. Angelo Borrelli. To have such an important event in Italy is significant, and especially in Confindustria, which is the main organization representing enterprises that this year is 110 years old, with more than 150,000 enterprises represented for a total amount of 5,500,000 employees and 220 associations, local association. It is with great interest that we look at the topics of the European Forum, as we are aware of the vulnerability of our country, especially in terms of exposure to seismic and hydrological risk. This vulnerability is increased due to extreme events that put the persons, people, and the activities to risk, jeopardizing the recovery, the economic recovery, and the social fabric of territories involved. So we want to be active in cooperating with the institutions to define programs to reduce disaster risk. We work for the competitiveness of the country, and protecting the territory means guaranteeing the continuity of productive activities to safeguard the whole community, of which the enterprise is the beating heart. It is for this reason that enterprises and institutions, public and private systems, need to make an effort, a joint effort, in the interest of all, starting from investment in prevention and mitigation of risks to protect people and the environment and creating new development opportunities. Then, in order to invest in new technologies for risk reduction and recovery activity for essential services after emergencies. We have the Memorandum of Understanding between Confindustria and the Department of Civil Protection, which was signed in 2016, and with such memorandum, we shared common targets to promote operative synergies and prevention actions, preparation and response to emergencies, involving citizens and enterprises, which are the main stakeholders in the civil protection system. In the tradition of our organization, which is open to the society and it's an expression of a productive system which is rooted in the territory and committed for the growth and development, we launched the emergency management program, which was presented in the European Forum in Turkey in 2017. This program was created after the earthquake in Emilia-Romagna in 2012. After this earthquake, which hit Central Italy in August 2016, this program became a national project to allocate the resources to the community, resources which were donated by enterprises along with the Department of Civil Protection. In this way, we created a network to intervene in a coordinated, efficient, and fast way. Thanks to this cooperation, we reached the aim of bringing what is needed, when is needed, where is needed. This project, and more in general, our commitment in this context, has its strong points in the huge connection between enterprises, territory, communities, and the synergy between public and private sectors. And together we are committed today on the national territory, certain that with knowledge, awareness, and cooperation are important to build together resilient communities. Thank you.
Grazie, dottor.
Thank you, Dr. Robiglio, for your kind words, and thank you for hosting us this event. Now, we have a small ceremony, a traditional ceremony. So I would like to ask the President Conte and Ms. Mami Mizutori to knock the hammer that will give the the sound of the beginning of this work.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Ms. Mizutori. To conclude this first session, I would ask Alessandro Farruggia to take this seat to start the first session. And the President and Ms. Mizutori will leave the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We will start the panel in 2 minutes. So, ciao. It's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask everybody to sit because we're going to start our round table. If please everybody can sit down. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please, can you sit so we can start the round table, please? Thank you. Ancora questo gruppo qua è abbastanza. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We can start the round table on making the economic case for disaster risk reduction and sustainable financing. The threat of climate change is adding to that one that comes from natural disasters. The total reported economic losses caused by weather and climatic-related extremes in the European member countries over the 1980-2015 period amounted to over 433 billion of euros. This posed unsustainable losses on the European economy. A sound financial system that integrates disaster risks can lessen significantly these impacts, speed up recovery and reconstruction, and harness knowledge and incentives for reducing risks. A comprehensive financial strategy can deliver informed risk management and governance. The insurance sector can play an important role of absorber of risks. This session aims to identify how the disaster risk reduction business and finance communities to work more closely together to leverage common goals and implement the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. I will briefly introduce now the panel members, which are Mrs. Cecilie Daae, which is Director General of the Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection. She's Director General since September 2015. Then we'll have Mr. Idar Kreutzer, which is CEO of Finance Norway. He was, since 2015, he was member of the Norwegian Commission for Green Competitiveness. Then from December 2017, he was appointed by the Nordic Council of Ministers to evaluate the access to risk capital for companies in the Nordic region. He launched a report in 2018. Then we will have Veronica Scotti, which was appointed Chairperson Global Partnership of Swiss Re. Swiss Re is one of the world's leading providers of reinsurance, insurance, and other forms of insurance-based risk transfer. And prior of Swiss Re, she was working with investment banks in UK, Switzerland, and Italy. Then we will have Maria Bianca Farina, which is president of ANIA. Before, she was chairwoman of Poste Vita and Poste Assicura. She's chairwoman of ANIA since 2015. And last but not least, we will have Mr. Livio Gallo, which is infrastructure and network director of Enel. He is head of the Enel infrastructure and network area since July 2014. I will I invite the panel members to an opening remark, and then there will be a second session, a second round where I will make them questions, and then the audience can also make questions. There is a Q&A session, and you can, the audience can use the pigeonhole system to make questions. The first one that I call is Mr. Cecilie Daae. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. The time to repair a roof is when the sun is shining, John F. Kennedy said. Timeliness of action is important, and the time is now. Making the economic case for disaster risk reduction and sustainable financing may be the most powerful tool in our action plan, both in prevention and preparedness. 4 main points seen from the governmental point of view, my point of view as the DG for the Directorate for Civil Protection in Norway. Point 1. Disasters do not respect borders of any kind. A severe event may be triggered within a sector, but the consequences can reach far throughout society. Each sector has to take responsibility by looking at their own system and how they can make them resilient. But it's not enough with the whole of a governmental approach. A whole of society approach is needed, including the individual level, each and one of us. Point 2. Solutions must be found in all sectors. No man is an island. Everyone owns the problem and the solution. Knowledge must be shared cross-sectorial, cross-regional, cross-national, and interdependencies and risks of cascading effects must be detected and shared. Risk and vulnerability assessments must be the knowledge base for disaster risk reduction planning at all sectors and levels. And point 3, we can't just blame the weather. A common knowledge base is essential. And building resilient societies relies on an all-hazards approach, but well-documented and verified knowledge is the key. The DSB Knowledge Bank is a system which will compile data from various sources, making them available and understandable in order to reduce disaster risks for knowledge-based planning, decide measure reducing risks, plan for early warning systems, preparedness and response, and finally building back and learn from the experiences. And finally, public-private partnership is key, both strategically and on an operational level, in my opinion. EU numbers address that probably more than 70% of critical infrastructure is not only in private ownership, but in global ownership. And the private sector is, of course, a huge source of knowledge and resources, and we have mutual interest in and for cooperation. But then how to do it? How do we find common arenas, projects that can release the power of public-private partnership? One example, our example, DSP together with Finance Norway work together on how to achieve a better knowledge base for a disaster risk reduction. The insurance sector has substantial data on damage and costs from adverse events. Planners at all levels need such data in planning and development. And such insurance data will be shared in the knowledge bank. The insurance and banking sector know the costs of disasters. Thus, they are a key driving force, not only to reduce losses, but to ensure investments which enhance resilience in society and societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cecilie Daae. The Norwegian example is very interesting. Now I call Mr. Idar Kreutzer and give him the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As a representative from the financial services community, we see society being more affected by climate change and extreme weather events. It affects people in their daily lives. It affects business, affecting their risk they have to manage and the revenues they receive, and it affects the finance sector, both increased cost of losses and lost revenue. As a society, we spend more resources on reconstructing after damage. I would put forward to you that it is a very strong business case for increasing the investments in prevention to reduce future cost. And we need fundamentally to redirect investments to be able to manage the cost picture that is developing in front of our eyes. And we heard this morning that the return on effective investments in prevention can be as high as 15 times the original investment. Finance is fundamentally, the core of finance is risk. Understand risk, manage risk, mitigate risk, and price risk. The insurance sector has two key contributions. One is, as Cecilie pointed out, to collect and analyze data that can be used by insurers to underwrite and price risk, but also can be used wider in the wider society to increase our effectiveness in planning for resilient local communities. The second contribution from insurance is to price risk correctly, and through the risk pricing, give the right incentives to invest in preventive measures. But in addition to the insurance sector, the banks have a growing importance through implementing the understanding of climate risk into their credit processes. In addition to that, asset managers are, through, among other things, the TCFD framework, collecting data, implementing data into their investment decisions. As a consequence of all this, the cost of capital that business and society will see will be directly affected by the understanding and the pricing of risk, which happens through the financial services sector. To be effective in utilizing these competences, the financial services sector needs a framework for cooperation with the public sector. And in that context, we are thrilled that the Directorate for Civil Protection have agreed to enter into a framework agreement with the Norwegian financial services sector. It helps us being more effective. It enables us to have a platform, a non-competition platform, where we can supply information and the Directorate, based on national priorities, are developing strategies to mitigate and prevent risk. The pilot project that we started in the financial services sector a couple of years ago, together with 10 municipalities in Norway, collecting and using the claims data from the insurance sector and feeding that into the municipalities' planning processes, have proven, I would say, surprisingly effective. One of the municipalities in the pilot project is the capital of Norway, Oslo. And if we look at the planning maps prior to the pilot project and after the pilot project, the municipality of Oslo has a fundamentally different and much stronger framework for prioritizing both their investments and preventing risks from happening. The rollout of this, national rollout of this pilot project now can happen due to the public-private partnership between Finance Norway and the Directorate for Civil Protection in Norway. To conclude, we need to redirect more investments from fixing damages to preventing risk. To do that, we need to understand fundamentally the value of prevention. The financial services sector can be helpful in doing that. We need platforms for effective public-private partnerships, and we are starting to see effective platforms being developed, and we are looking forward to moving into the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kreutzer. Very interesting, this Norwegian example. Now, let's hear the voice of the insurance and reinsurance sector. I give the floor to Mrs. Veronica Scotti from Swiss Re.
So I want to start by thanking Alessandro and the UN Office for the Disaster Risk Reduction for inviting me to join this panel. And I'm delighted actually to be following Cecile and Idar's comments, because I will be building a little bit on your commentaries and trying to explain to this estimated group of people why financial resilience is actually important. And you don't need to believe me, but there is a statement from the OECD and the G20 report on disaster risk assessment and financial from 2015 that says financial resilience is a critical component of effective disaster risk management. So it's why. It's true both at macroeconomic and microeconomic level, and I'll try and articulate in 5 minutes the two dimensions. Fundamentally, resilience is about the ability to bounce back after a shock. That's what it is. So financially, if we look at a study from the Bank of International Settlements, which analyzed the impact of 2,500 natural catastrophe events globally, what can be found and demonstrated quite relevantly from a statistical standpoint is that those economies where insurance, which is a very well-proven risk transfer mechanism, is not the only one, but it's a very well-proven risk transfer mechanism, where insurance penetration is higher, not only we see a smaller impact on the economy, but also a much faster bouncing back of the economic milieu. And I think that's quite an important element to take in mind. In those countries where, in fact, there is more fragility, where there isn't a risk planning mechanism and a risk transfer mechanism, it is, in fact, demonstrated that families will take up to 2 generations before they can get back to their feet before the event. So this is a huge cost, and I think the President of Confindustria really delivered that message earlier about how the cost at individual level really transmits in a cost for the economy overall and in competitiveness. I would say, though, that the picture is not just an emerging market or developing economy problem. If we look within Europe, only 1/3 of the losses in Europe are today protected. And this means that a number of families and assets and private assets are today still exposed. Interestingly, the distribution of the exposure is very uneven. And it's uneven in 2 ways. If we look at it from a perils perspective, 50% of the European families are protected against wind, but less than 10% against earthquake. And I'm not exactly sure why, one peril is deemed more important than the other, and about somewhere in between when it comes to floods. So the risk perception is very unevenly distributed. Even more so, when we look at the European horizon across different countries, the penetration of insurance and risk preparedness is very, very different. So I would submit that countries like France, Spain, Norway, Switzerland, where effectively there is either mandatory compulsory insurance for NatCat, or there is, like in the case of UK, a multi-year program of 25 years to help the penetration of a commercial insurance market by creating a partnership between the government and the insurance industry, specifically in the case of flood, that penetration is much higher. In those countries where a pure voluntary model exists, we're looking at the single-digit or low double-digit penetration. And that really leaves the most vulnerable elements of the population still exposed, both financially and beyond economically. I believe that $1 of protection through an insurance mechanism is not the same as $1 of protection through post-disaster intervention from government, and I'd like to articulate why. Insurance provides very clear criteria, contractually defined, and processes on how to distribute that compensation, both to homeowners and businesses. Let's take the example of Japan or Chile. Both countries were affected by earthquakes in 2010 and 2011. And within respectively 5 to 10 months from the event striking, we had already a 90% to 99% claim settlement in those countries, which meant that within less than a year, those who were protected actually received their funds and they could actually work on reconstruction at their own terms. Insurance also creates incentives for risk prevention. I think that was the point that Cecile made before, and risk mitigation. And I would offer the example of Australia, where following a pretty disastrous and devastating flood event in 2011, the government and the insurance industry entered into an explicit partnership. The government developed dams that prevented the city of Rome, which happened to be an homonymous of our host today, which was very heavily affected. They developed the dams that were needed to actually remove and reduce the risk on the territory. And the insurance industry had to work on harmonization of wording and contracts so that the coverage could be more readily understood, readily available, and more affordable. And as a result, we don't have the same exposure and the same financial consequences today that we had 10 years ago. I would say the close collaboration between the industry and the state comes both in the risk assessment and prevention, but also in an alignment of interests. Let me remind you, insurance companies benefit when the losses are mitigated. It's central to our business model, so we have all the incentives possible to try and make sure that that loss mitigation is carried out because it benefits us and it benefits our policyholders. In particular, I would like to offer that there are 2 areas where Europe could look at taking a couple of additional steps forward. First, I think we need to move from a model which is extremely well-intended but unfortunately economically not sustainable of post-disaster intervention to a model of pre-disaster management. And when it comes to governments, the recognition that the risk is equally shared across society and creative incentives for individuals, corporations, organizations to actually own and manage their own risk needs to be strongly incented in Europe, so that in partnership between a government and the insurance sector, we can allow a market mechanism to operate more fluidly than today already happens. And we can make sure that the limited funds that governments have today at sovereign but also a local level can be directed towards emergency and towards those reconstruction efforts that truly cannot be afforded otherwise. Private interests and private assets can be protected through market-level mechanisms. The second area is actually one of innovation, and I think we need to look internationally. Many sovereign states around the world have been looking to protection for their own assets, for critical infrastructures, or for natural assets that are of relevance to protect through risk transfer mechanisms. And this is typically done by the utilization of parametric covers. The beauty of these covers is that they truly allow a very quick liquidity disbursement mechanism. And there are plenty of examples in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the US, in China, that Europe can look at where successfully these mechanisms have been implemented. And what it allows is actually a closer partnership between the local authorities and the Ministry of Finance. So I'd just like to conclude my remarks with an invitation to have all Ministries of Finance in Europe join the disaster risk management dialogue, because I believe that as CFOs for the countries, they have a vested interest in making sure that the fiscal budgets are well managed and well directed and not subject to shocks going forward. And I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for your speech, rich of practical examples of our case studies. Now I give the floor to Maria Bianca Farina, which is president of ANIA, the Association of the Insurance Industries here in Italy.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning to everyone. I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to this important event. I am delighted to be here today. I represent the insurance system in Italy, and I would like to talk about prevention in particular and sustainable financing. In particular, I would like to stress the importance of these topics for our sector. Insurance companies are involved, are at the forefront. As in the management of risk from a climate perspective, and also for the role they play as investors, as institutional investors. That work in a long-term logic. I would like to stress these two topics. I will start with the first topic in the mission of insurances. I will talk about how evident it is that the number of natural disasters has increased in terms of the number of accidents and in terms of the severity of these events and on the impact of such events on our economy and society. A recent report of the Office for Disaster Risk Reduction of the UN stated that between 1980 and 2017, the catastrophes correlated to climate provoked 1.5 million casualties and 5 million injured or homeless or obliged to leave their homes. The same report states that the damages of extreme weather events of the last 20 years increased by 151% compared to the previous 20 years. In 2017 only, the total damages provoked by natural disasters accounted for $330 billion. One of the highest ever. Alongside these trends, there is another trend as well, a global trend, namely the increase of the protection gap. A gap which is the difference between total economic damage and insured damage. Well, this gap is estimated for 2017 to be $200 billion. In other words, the increase of the frequency and the severity of catastrophes, of catastrophe damages, makes the lack of insurance coverage evident and clear, and it highlights the need to have tools to protect our citizens in a more adequate way. For this reason, in our opinion, it is essential to adopt a mixed system, public and private system, a system that can manage this risk and prevent it instead of managing the effects of catastrophes. This way, we can overcome the limits of the public systems, which are, for example, long times, uncertainty, no incentives to prevention. At the same time, it avoids the risks of private systems. The limits can be the difficulty in the startup phase and the high costs for citizens that live in the areas more affected. Mixed systems to handle such risks are used in many European and non-European countries. But this is not a solution we have adopted in Italy yet. In Italy, we have a voluntary system. Therefore, our state intervenes only in emergency conditions in the aftermath of the accidents, trying to repair the damages. Another fundamental aspect, as I was saying before, is the role of the insurance companies as institutional investors. They can give their contribution from an environmental point of view with their investments. Only in Italy, insurance companies have 850 billion euros in investments in their portfolio. Well, the assessment of the SG impacts correlated to the company activities, to be honest, is increasingly the focus of our operators. And believe me, they are really focusing on these topics. But regulators as well are keeping an eye on this. The insurance industry has a business model which is long-term, a long-term model. So it is fundamental to orient the investments for a sustainable development. Sector shares the goals of sustainable financing of the European Union, and I can assure you we really support sustainable financing and a green economy in the European Union. As for the innovation of products, we are witnessing an increasing effort in the protection of environment and society. Thank you for your attention.
And now I call Mr. Livio Gallo from Enel.
Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning.
Good morning to everyone.
For this invitation and for being part of this important event. Thank you very much. Enel is a leading utility active in all the sectors of the energy value chain, generation, renewable, transmission, distribution and sales, and we are present in 35 countries across 5 continents. With a managed capacity of 89,000 megawatts, out of which 31,000 are renewables. And we distribute energy, electricity, to 73 million customers worldwide, using our network spanning 2.2 million of kilometers, more or less 6 times the distance between the Earth and the Moon. And at the end, we deliver electricity to 200 million people worldwide. We are present in Europe, in Italy, Spain, Romania mainly, and in Latin America and in all the mega cities, in Lima, Bogotá, Santiago, Buenos Aires, Rio, Sao Paulo, Goiânia, and Fortaleza. Looking at our most recent experience, let's call it experience, we are often called to face increasingly different external threats in the various geographical areas where we are in. Just think about the exceptional snowfall in the region of Abruzzo last year in 2017, with over 2 meters of snow. Or let's think of a storm 2 weeks ago, also mentioned by our President, Mr. Conte, which caused over 1 million of trees to fall in the northern region of Veneto. And in these events, for recovering power of supply, for recovering the distribution of electricity to our customer, we installed about 2,000 transportable emergency generators, also making use of helicopters in cooperation with the Civil Protection, Italian Army and institutions. 2 weeks ago, also, we experienced a very heavy windstorm in Sao Paulo, with more than 500,000 of customers disconnected. And we still remember the heavy snowstorm in Santiago of last year and landsliding in Peru. So in line with the agenda of the 2030 for sustainable development, we are very committed to communities, helping them access education, healthcare, and employment. And I would like to highlight that our strategy is built around a wide array of SDG, of Sustainable Development Goals, and these efforts are embedded with our core business processes in our daily operation, in our strategy at all levels of the organization. Regarding to this event, I would like to say that our commitment, our experience about disaster recovery reduction, risk reduction is very high. And we firmly believe that the critical event management is the application of strategy and operational practices for allowing to deal with sudden and disruptive events which may significantly affect quality of service to the citizen, to our customers, business operations, financial performance, as was mentioned before, reputation, public safety. Critical events can occur as a result of an unpredictable event or as an unforeseeable consequence, condition of some events previously considered as a potential risk. In both cases, it requires a very fast decision-making. Establishing monitoring system, early detection practices to an unforeseeable event, as well as training of crisis personnel, testing of emergency procedures, are critical components of a robust critical event management organization. Also, the implementation of innovative technologies, a robust communication infrastructure during the crisis, ICT application based on big data and artificial intelligence are essential and play today a major role. Finally, critical event forecasting, the impact assessment, the crisis team composition, and the decision-making, the operational response, but not least communication and media interactions, are part of the issues that have to be carefully planned and periodically tested, which is very important, periodically tested in order to implement an effective crisis management, critical event manager, and to allow a reduction of the economic impact of a disaster risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gallo. It's interesting to hear the point of view of a great utility like Enel. Now, second round, I have some question for the panelists. I will start with Cecilie Daae. My question is in relation to Norway's innovative public-private partnership. What are the key elements that make the partnership so successful, and what would be your advice to other countries considering a similar initiative? Thank you.
Difficult question, but Norway is, of course, a small country with rather great ambitions, and sometimes it's of help, I think, that we are close to each other, and it's not difficult to get to know people in Norway because we are not that few. But firstly, I think there is a mutual interest for cooperation. Idar and his people have really wanted to cooperate with us as a Directorate for Civil Protection. Norway is exposed to many different hazards, and the costs associated with loss and damage are very high. We actually had a harsh forest fire season also in Norway, but due to different circumstances, we didn't end up like Sweden. But maybe next time this will be different. I think we acknowledge that there is an interest both from the state and the insurance sector to combine our efforts on prevention to reduce future losses. Secondly, I think we have a clear and joint vision on where we want to go, and the work with the Knowledge Bank, I think it's very important to try to work out a way of working out in a private-public partnership. And the insurance sector sees that their data can be used as input to risk and vulnerability assessments. And from our side, it's very important to get this knowledge to make the planning and the planners better off when they are planning. Thirdly, I think that DSB, we have an overall coordinating role for disaster risk reduction, which means that we work cross-sectorial on any level all the time, And it means that we are in a good position also to work out the public-private partnership arenas, I think, because we don't have them actually yet. We have some broad projects, but we have not the regular meeting places, which we must have, I think, if we are going on with risk reduction work together, and we will. And then I think the most important thing actually there is that we both see this cooperation as a win-win situation actually. So we are trying now with the Knowledge Bank, and I really hope that we will work further on with different projects and different arenas as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilie. A question for Idar, again on Norway. Norway financial sector is leading reforms to make the financial sector more sustainable, including through the roadmap for green competitiveness. How does this factor in disaster risk and drive greater resilience?
Thank you. No, first of all, the Norwegian financial services sector is a rather advanced one when it comes to utilizing new technologies. We benefit from the fact that the Nordic regions is probably one of the most digitalized regions in the world. That reflects also the work and the processes and the models used in the insurance and the financial services sector. So, and we have a multiple of institutions. We are a small country, but we have 140 banks being active in Norway, and we have close to 100 different insurance-related activities. So it was a challenge for us to try to develop a mutual perspective from this industry when it comes to sustainable finance. And we decided to start a roadmap exercise where we asked ourselves 3 key questions. How do we see the role of financial services in a low-carbon society in 2030 and 2050? And what are the key contributions from the financial services sector? And the third question is, what can we do ourselves, and what do we need to cooperate with others to deliver? And the process in itself was very, very important. Through workshops, through meetings, through seminars, we developed a mutual answer between the financial services players on these 3 questions. So when we presented the roadmap in June, I think it's the first national comprehensive roadmap from the entire financial services sector in a country. That also formed as a platform for the discussion with the Directorate for Civil Protection and with other industries in Norway wanting to interact with the financial services sector. So my first point is that by establishing that platform, we enable the dialogue and the dialogues that's necessary. Secondly, when it comes to disaster risk, we are following that on 3 levels. One is the global level, trying to understand what are the role of the direct insurer in the relationship with the reinsurers in developing the models and the understanding to increase global resilience. The second level is the regional level, national and the cooperation with the countries in the Nordic region. And the third level is the local level. And, you know, global challenges, they have to find local solutions. So it is important for us to work with institutions that has the local access. The Directorate for Civil Protection has legitimacy, competence, and local access. It's a fantastic partner for us in trying to reach out and use the competences we have and the knowledge we have in a much more effective way. So I guess that's some of the key elements.
Very interesting. I have a question for Veronica Scotti. How can we scale up this public-private partnership that support to government to reduce their losses? And another question is on the investment side. How do we ensure investment support greater disaster resilience and don't create new risks?
I'll try to articulate both. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'll try to have complementary thoughts to Idar, with whom I fully agree. I'll give an example, which is Mexico, because I think we can always learn from case studies. I love case studies. A lot of European countries, we've heard, have pretty important natural catastrophe exposures. Mexico is no exception. And yet I think is quite an illustrious case, because back in 2006, they decided to buy their first insurance protection. So they created a fund for natural catastrophes. So that's quite important, because they've established a mechanism, recognized that they have a problem, and established a mechanism to fund through their own means the protection and the interventions for natural catastrophes. A number of countries around the world have such natural disaster funds. What Mexico did, though, back in 2006, is to look for ways of protecting that fund, and they decided to use a cat bond, a catastrophe bond. It's a protection through capital markets. Through that exercise, they actually learned that there was a cost associated with it, as you can imagine. And they said, okay, we now pay for this, but how could we reduce the cost? And that put the country on a 20-year journey, nearly, of how to understand the risks, how to better assess them, and how to best spend the money of the fund. So what they've done, they started to build their own country risk model. They created an infrastructure for that. They created a role of country risk officer. So that's a very interesting perspective, because then, you know, there are so many risks, and we heard it today, there are man-made risks, there are natural catastrophe risks. So how do you spend the funds that exist? And through that, they decided to eventually move, as they understood the risk better, and they understood that the bond was only going to cover under certain circumstances, but not always, that because they now had the data in their hands, they could buy what we call is an indemnity cover, so something that pays exactly for the risks and the losses as they manifest in the country. That was a step that they took in 2012, so 6 years later. That exercise also required them, though, to have a way of disbursing the funds, so that forced the country, a country, not an insurance company, to think about disbursement mechanisms and having to think about how would they administer that claims, handling protocol. And as a result of that exercise that the federal government in Mexico went through, they're now trying to cascade it down to the regional governments. So there is a learning that goes from the top of the house all the way down to different levels of governments and creates a real impact down to the municipalities eventually, which is where really the rubber hits the road when you have to interface with populations that are in these rails. So I find it's a very, very interesting model to reflect on, because through that learning you create transparency, you create mechanisms that are very efficient eventually, that really create the best spend for the money. So if I were to sum it up in a nutshell, what we can take away from the Mexican story is putting a price on risk for governments to drive better decisions, the discipline that comes with having to go through a loss adjustment mechanism, and that transparency that eventually creates also an ability to dialogue with the population. Why have we spent money the way we spend it? And that's a sensing mechanism. And better use of budget and resources, because not everything will be protected through an insurance or risk transfer mechanism, but you need to have a system to decide what is best kept on your own shoulders and what's best transferred. And that's an optimization exercise that is worth going through. How can we scale it up? I think the core is having an holistic risk management approach. And very few countries today have that in place to decide between risk adaptation, risk monitoring, mitigation, and eventually risk financing. So I would really encourage to look at that. It's all in the Sendai framework. These are not original thoughts, but some have taken more steps than others.
Thank you, Veronica. I have a question for Maria Bianca Farina. How big could be the impact of the environmental factor on the insurance sector.
If we are talking about Italy, we can say that the impact of environmental disasters is really low. Italy is a country that is extremely fragile in the field of catastrophes, of environmental catastrophes. According to recent studies we carried out, 78% of Italian houses is exposed to medium-high risk of earthquakes and floods. Of these houses, only 3% is covered by an insurance policy. Civil Protection said that the state for this kind of intervention spent during the last 20 years 7 billion euros a year for emergency interventions in the aftermath of the event, with results which were not always effective. Yesterday I read in the newspaper that since the last earthquake in Umbria region that occurred 2 years ago, only 0.2% of buildings was rebuilt. Well, the protection gap is so evident, so strong, that it makes the country even more fragile in these frequent events that have become a feature of Italy. We believe that we really cannot procrastinate the organization of a system, a private-public partnership system that uses resources of both partners to work at its best. The insurance sector formulated many projects from this point of view, elaborated several models, because this partnership can be expressed in several ways, with responsibilities, organized responsibilities, and shared responsibilities, of course, focusing on prevention. We make our expertise available, starting from the assessment and handling of risk, quick intervention and active intervention, as we are able to do to assist after the events, and we can take part in the security system of our country from this perspective. So far, we presented several projects, but we haven't found a solution yet to the problem, a real strong position of our government on these topics. To be honest, I must say that last year we launched important fiscal incentives. They launched important fiscal incentives. Quota is not and taxes, for example, but such measures provoked an increase of insured people by 2-3%. This also says that there is a lack of culture of insurances, because people tend to rely on the intervention of the state in the aftermath of the events. But now we must really act as other industrialized and developed countries. I think we are one of the last countries which has not an organized system in this sense. We must really make an effort, and I believe that we can give an important contribution. We are ready to collaborate at our best.
And from me is to Livio Gallo. In the next 40 years, the largest investments are expected to take place in energy and transport infrastructure. In annual operations and in the broader energy sector in Europe, how is disaster risk currently factored in, and how do we ensure that all the investments are risk-proof?
I think now it is clear to everyone that the disasters and these critical events are more and more frequent and more severe, such as storms, flood, droughts, typhoons, flood, hurricane, earthquake. And these macro trends prompted to develop more advanced mechanisms of forecasting, analysis, risk mitigation, and operational management. No? We decided in November 2017 for this reason also to join to participate to a task force on climate-related financial disclosure, also in order to acquire further elements to better assess how certain future climate scenarios can impact on our group, and specifically on the quality of service for our customers. We are also working together with international institutions to develop long-term climate scenarios using innovative technologies to obtain information with increasing accurate precision. What about the analysis, prevention, and planification? In our pillars of our strategy, we do include sustainability and resilience, and also digitalization and innovation. Now, sustainability and resilience are concepts included also in the Sendai framework. And related to the electrical system, resilience is a key word, it's a very important word. What does it mean, resilience, in our meaning? Resilience for a network is the ability to resist to external probative stresses and to restore service as soon as possible. We have been working in the past year for mapping the critical factors to make our network, can make our networks vulnerable. In addition to classic atmosphere phenomena, we have to count also on tornadoes in Argentina and Spain, seismic events in Chile and Peru. And we have been working for mapping and classify these risks. We have defined and mapped geographically these risks related to snow, in particular in Europe, and the probability of icing connected to our conductors. And in this risk-based investment logic, we have identified a multi-year investment plan for replacing these conductors with new technologies. A similar work, of course, is also underway for other types of risk. Every year we plan a so-called Piano Inverno, winter plan, for Italy, Spain, and Romania, and the Plan Verano, a summer plan specifically in South America for Argentina and Brazil. We invest on an average 3.5 billion euros in our networks in the world, and it's clear that one of our primary concerns is that these interventions are risk-proof in a long-term logic, based, first of all, on the historical critical event analysis, second, on the results of restoration activities, and on the implementation of the study of more robust solutions on the asset, but also on technological innovation and network digitalization. Distributed intelligence, automation, IoT sensors, artificial intelligence, and big data play a major role in our case. Also, I have to say, it is very important, I think, that also other fundamental players are accelerators of these processes. And because we are working in a regulated market, the authority and the governmental institutions are very important and play a major role. Of course, there is a convergence of interest between operators and regulators to adequately incentivize the intervention of the assets. There are several positive signs, I think, related to these topics in some countries, and the authorities now introducing new schemes that allow distribution to support our huge investment. Another important element in our case is the improvement of the emergency management operation. During emergencies, the traffic, typically the impact on the territory make impracticable or delay the action of our workforce. And in order to avoid this dangerous situation, we have to work very closely with the local police, local institution, local civil protection to make use of drones, helicopters, of new technologies. I would like to stress that is my personal experience that in extreme conditions, no institution, no company, no subject can withstand or face this adversity alone. No one. So the key word, the key issue is cooperation. Cooperation is of utmost importance. Secondly, communication is also very important for informing the citizen, the customer, of the status and the time of restoring the service. In our experience, also for cities and megacities, emergency models are necessary also in case of a so-called high impact, low probability, that take into account interdependency, that means between electrical infrastructure and other infrastructure. We have, as I said before, 72 million customers distributed in 8 different countries, and during this emergency, the communication channels, social networks, chatbot, real-time power cat map on websites are very important for inform frequently the customer, the citizens of the status of the restoration. Finally, we have 2 main guidelines which we factor in for managing emergency, and are the increasing of a share of distributed generation, of decentralized generation, of course, and the development of disruptive solutions brought from a technological and operational capacity point of view. Cooperation is a key word, and also the public-private partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gallo. Now we go to the questions from the audience, questions that came from the pigeonhole system. I will start with the question to Idar. How do you price insurance risk with high uncertainty like climate change and cascading consequences?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, I think it will be some time before we see a climate change insurance policy being offered in the market. I mean, a general climate change policy is, of course, extremely complicated. So what is happening is that we are trying to understand the climate change consequences and try to dig that down into specific risks that's possible to understand, manage, and price. And in that context, we mentioned the reporting framework that is being suggested from the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. They are focusing on scenarios for businesses thinking through what will happen if. And that kind of competence, that kind of understanding is added to the actual understanding that is being built in the insurance companies based on actual claims to better be able to price something that we think will happen but has not yet emerged. But another side of that issue, one part of it is the thing we really, which is fundamentally unpredictable, which we are used to deal with in insurance. But the other side of that issue is the increased predictability of climate-related damages. I mean, if you have a factory very close to a large river, the predictability increases that you will be affected by flood regularly. And up to a certain point we can deal with that, but after a certain point the asset will be uninsurable. And that is another question. When do we move from something that is insurance, which is actually to deal with some things fundamentally unpredictable, into more systematic financing mechanisms where the predictability is high? So that's, I guess, some of the puzzles we need to figure out together.
A question to Veronica. Are there examples of insurance companies investing part of their profit gained from premiums to disaster prevention projects?
I hope you can hear me. I think there are. I mean, I'm going to reference my own organization because it's the one that I know best, but I would invite both Idar and Maria Bianca if they have comments themselves. I can think of a handful of ways we've tried to do exactly that. So first of all, I don't know if you're familiar with the economics of climate adaptation studies, but Swiss Re started studying climate change about 30 years ago. So we are in the financial sectors, I'm going to say, if not the first one of the first ones that actually advocated on the importance of understanding climate phenomenon and studying and preventing in that sense. And whilst I think the advocacy work has been going on for over 30 years, the journey around the pricing, to Idar's point, continues to develop. But about 10, 15 years ago, we worked on what we call the economics of climate adaptation. We thought we needed to develop a methodology that could be used by anyone that was interested, mostly towards municipalities, to try really and understand the risk they're exposed to, and then how could they adapt and how they could best spend their money. And we've conducted, these are expensive studies, it's over $500,000 a piece, right? Before you then go into the execution. But we funded this ourselves because we wanted to really increase a science-informed risk awareness that would drive then the right decisions. And we did over 20 of these studies around the world. And we realized that through and through, over 60% of the losses could actually be avoided. Now, if you avoid the losses, you're actually moving into the risk prevention space. You can reduce the premium that you pay, because frankly, the insurance premium is the sum of the losses that you experience plus some modeling based on the exposure that you carry. So there is a very direct way of controlling the spend, and it's around loss prevention. So that would be one example. By the way, those studies, the methodology is open source, is available. Anyone who wants to use it can find it. We wanted to really make it for everyone use, and it's for free. Risk modeling, it's also something that we continue to invest as an organization. There are a number of risk model firms around the world that make those available. I can name them if anyone is interested, but 4 or 5, and they've been adopted by all insurance companies and beyond. Swiss Re took a decision already 20 years ago to build our own risks and risk model, because it's the core of our business. But we do make our models, it's called CatNet. We make it available to all of our clients. And we make it available for free. You just have to be a client of Swiss Re. We could look into monetizing it, but I think we made a decision that it's so fundamental to advancement of protection and stability in the economy that should be funded. And it's frankly the single largest investment, R&D investment, that the company makes. So I hope these examples, they're not the only ones, but I hope they're concrete examples of how the industry commits to risk prevention.
Thank you, Veronica. Idar wants to add briefly on this, right?
Very brief on this, because let's just reflect quickly about some similar situations from the insurance industry's point of view. The insurance industry has for more than 100 years worked systematically with fire prevention, developing both the understanding of the value of the house that did not burn down, because we are excellent in understanding the value of the house that burnt. But we have developed an understanding of the value of the house that did not burn down due to effective prevention. And that is the understanding, and that is the thinking that is now gradually being adapted and transformed into disaster risk reduction. It is effective. We have done it for more than 100 years. It has been used, it is meaningful for insurance companies to reallocate resources into reducing risk, and it's beneficial for society.
Thank you. A question to Cecilia. Is it the market making the insurance available to financially vulnerable groups, or how to make insurance available to these groups?
Actually, I think that should go to the insurance side of it. But I took great interest in listening to the describing of the unevenness which is going on in this kind of play, because actually it will, if we are not handling or finding out a way to deal with that, we will not be successful in risk reduction work, not locally, not regionally, and not nationally, and not internationally. And I think this unevenness goes along other processes as well, which we have to kind of integrate. So I do not have that answer, but I think it's a very interesting one, and actually one which the state authorities and governments must have high on the agenda. I realize at least that.
Maybe also Maria Bianca Farina could add something on this. How is the market making insurance available to financially vulnerable groups?
Well, let's say that the best way is to reduce as much as possible the prices of insurance covers. This can be made in two ways. One, and the most important one, is the one that we've been talking about. So to reduce the cost of catastrophic events and also the scope of them. And how can we reach this aim? Working on all possible fields of prevention, starting from financing research on the fragility of the lands and the territories. For example, we have financed research, predictive research for earthquakes, to understand earthquakes also with national institutes, and to understand if the presence of said minerals in the land, in the soil, can predict the possibility of an earthquake, and so on. Then we also have prevention, and of course prevention reduces costs, so it makes the covers and these insurance covers accessible to everyone. There is also another topic to underline, which is how many people can access insurance covers, because it's clear that if we only insured people that are very much exposed to risk, the price would be much higher and by definition less accessible to those who are poorer and more vulnerable. There is no doubt then that in a social system, in an advanced social system, we can also think that poorer people are covered from these risks directly by the state, and that only from a threshold up we can have private resources.
Thank you. I have a question for Veronica now. Please elaborate on the link between insurance penetration and fast recovery. Isn't the link stronger between rich economies that can afford insurance coverage and recovery capacities?
Okay, I hope I understand the question, but I would submit these are two different two different aspects. So insurance does allow for fast recovery. One of the fastest growing insurance solutions today in the world, and it actually links back to the prior question around financial inclusion. So how do we make sure that the most impoverished or those who have the smallest means, what we call the emerging consumers, can actually get the protection that they need as fast as possible so that they don't stay impoverished, but actually you continue to see over a 20-year horizon the economic progress in a country. One of the solutions that we found, and it links back to what both Bianca and Idar have said, is affordability. So it has to be very, very affordable, and it has to be very readily paid out. And so speed in the payment is important, and that's why parametric solutions are nowadays, in those countries where the data are limited, the funds are limited, are one of the most effective ways to disburse and to give compensation. And we do that in conjunction to any sort of situation, whether it's a drought, which could be affecting farmers in Kenya, whether it has to do with water or water muds or slides, you know, in Southeast Asia. So there are ways to do it, and we do it in collaboration with governments and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which are very keen to use donor monies for good causes, for the populations that most need it, but they need to make sure that those dollars go very far. So this is a problem with the donor systems, that you get it 1 year, it's not in place for 20, 30 years. And we really need to plan on longer term interventions, which is why when we work with supranational organizations, with well-willing donors, with governments, we ask for a couple of things to happen. It's wonderful to get donor money. We need the local governments to be building the infrastructure in such a way that the next year, and 2 years from now, there won't be flooding. So I think it was Maria Bianca that made the comment, 5 million people have been affected in Europe and had to be replaced. Well, I can tell you that on an international scale, this is a huge phenomenon of forced migration that truly affects the economic fabric of a country. So if we can make it in such a way that the reconstruction happens with stronger resilience, what the Sendai framework calls building back better, then we truly have created an economic system of sustainability, because people are not forced to migrate, they can stay in their homeland, they can actually look at a prosperous re-establishment in their own country. So I think, I'm sorry, I kind of diverted from the original comment, but to me, this is very important to me. There has to be a partnership. Governments are responsible for the building codes. Insurance companies are responsible for affordable products. We can bridge it over, if we give ourselves a plan over a number of years, we can bridge it and we can make it sustainable longer term. But I'll answer the other question if they want to.
Okay. Idar, addressing the diverse level of disaster insurance penetration across Europe, who should drive the agenda forward?
I think that is a very, very important question. And, you know, the way I see it, you should assume that the insurance industry will be a driving force. But society needs to think through, would we like the insurance industry to be the driving force, or should we push forward and establish the arenas where the resources and the competences in the insurance industry can play effectively together with national governments, with the disaster directorates, with the competences and with local communities. And if you ask me, I think the latter is the better model. I think that meaningful, open, transparent cooperation, public-private partnerships is the best way of moving forward, because then we utilize resources and we do that in alignment with the priorities that drives the problems in the local communities.
Also, Cecilia could comment on this. I would like to understand if there are problems in the model that you choose. There are many opportunities. It worked well, it seems, but there were also some problems in implementing the model that you choose in Norway?
You mean the knowledge bank
Yeah.
model? Yeah, let me comment on that question first, because I don't think you could do it in any other way than public-partnership if we should solve this problem and the other problems relating to disaster risk management, because no government has the control over every system which we need to control, which I said about this critical system owned by 70% of private owners or global owners. And also, even for rich countries, I would say that we have not a sustainable system as now if we are not able to do something and address these questions together. I often get questions about, I was asked about vulnerable groups, and I think I understand the intention with that question, but very often I'm exposed to discussions about the municipalities regarding they as a vulnerable group. With lack of money, lack of competence, kind of lack of possibilities to handle this climate change and extreme weather consequences we see, and always addressing the need for more money. And probably they need more money, but that's hopefully a political question. But I'm addressing more and more that a lot of the work we do not need money. To not put on a fire and prevent forest fires, it's not expensive at all. It's just a thing you have to do. So I just had to address that regarding vulnerable groups. It is, of course, difficult to integrate public-private partnership as a model, if that was your question. Because we are very successful in some areas, but we don't have the kind of framework, the more generic framework for how to do this, at least not in Norway. We've done lots of work working with the cooperation between the civil public side and the defense in Norway. We have this total defense concept. In a way, we need to work out a kind of a framework which will be the public-private framework. I don't think we have difficulties with laws, but we can have with competition, for example. When we are trying, we have seen that when we are trying to get to use the insurance data. It could be role difficulties, maybe goal difficulties, but I think we actually understand that's the only way to get further on now in the general work with disaster risk reduction. And I think we get help because it changes so fast, so I think everyone acknowledges that we have to do this together, and we have to do it now.
We also have microphones, so if there are questions from the floor, they are more than welcome. Now I have a question for Maria Bianca Farina. What are the incentives to private investor for long-term investments when investors are asking for short-term results? This seems a big problem.
Well, you have to consider that we as insurers are dedicated to have a long-term saving, so to invest on operations that have a longer term. The incentives are fiscal incentives. They are not so strong as we would want to, but anyway, we have incentives. Of course, long-term investments have less liquidity, but there is indeed a return over time. So there is, anyway, we are convinced, and this is very important, that we can be a bridge between citizens and the country in helping the country to do investments that have long-term objectives with infrastructures that can safeguard from environmental risks, because of course we do not only finance new infrastructures, but also infrastructures that need maintenance and need to be refurbished and renovated. So the incentive is the conviction that this is the right way, long-term is the right way. So incentives that are more tangibles are the fiscal ones. In Italy, we have this program for long-term investments without taxes for citizens. And moreover, there is a bigger return of money on these kinds of investments. So this is for sure an incentive for investors.
Yeah, I agree with everything Maria said. But in addition, it is important to understand that new knowledge is always, that comes out in the market, is always discounted into the pricing and the pricing mechanisms immediately. So when we are getting new knowledge about the consequences of climate change, investors are starting to ask questions: what are the consequences for your business? And if the answers are that, well, we are putting our head in the sand and we hope that everything will pass, then investors will say, okay, I increase the risk for your cash flow going forward, and you will have an immediate value effect now. So even if it's a long-term consequence into the future, new knowledge will be discounted and it will have value effects now. So the question assumes that it is a discrepancy here that in effect is not as big as it seems. So it is meaningful, and that is also the fundamental driver behind the new reporting system, that we have a more systematic, comparable reporting system for consequences for business models and cash flows going forward.
We have time probably for one more question, and I invite everybody that wants to talk from the floor, please do it. Raise your hand, just in case. Okay.
It's a hand up there.
That's a question up there. Can you tell your name?
My name is Vijay Kumar. I work for GNDR, which is a global network of civil society organizations. And it's great to listen to all of you. It's really a good discussion and input as well. I was just wondering what we are talking of here, how that relates, and how the community who are affected by or exposed to the various forms of risk, how they are involved. What is the mechanism of bringing them on board and ensuring that they understand what the risk that they're living in and what are the ways that they can get the benefit from the financing that we are actually talking of. It will be useful to hear if there is any example.
To whom is the question?
I would actually think perhaps Veronica touched upon that, even Maria touched upon it. Perhaps it will be useful to actually hear, is there any specific example where we have included the communities who are exposed to the disasters, particularly the women and the person living with disabilities?
It's clear. Maybe Veronica can answer.
I have to apologize, but there is a lot of noise, so I couldn't hear absolutely anything. Do you mind repeating, Alessandro? I don't know if... or anyone who can summarize it.
Can you repeat in short form your question, please?
What is the involvement, how the communities who are living in exposed to the various risks are involved in the things that you are talking of, particularly the women and the person with disabilities?
The communities, the role of the communities.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question, and apologies for asking you to repeat it. So I have to say, I represent a global reinsurance company, so we do have offices around the world, but we're not the ones that will be interfacing with the community continuously. But I'm happy to give you some indication of what I've seen in the context, for instance, of very recent fires in Canada. Before coming back to Europe, I was based in Canada for a number of years, and that was the most devastating natural catastrophe event that occurred. You might have heard about it, Fort McMurray. And the community, the industry, the local civil society had to come together because of the remoteness of the place. People had to be evacuated. They lost pretty much everything. 80% of the population lost their entire houses. By the way, they lived in such a remote place because it was very close to an extraction site for coal. So they needed to, they also could not go back to work for a period. I think it's always quite dramatic when you are interfacing with a community of people where the vast majority loses everything they've had up until that point. What I would suggest is, you know, the elements of compassion. The industry really needs, and I think it was made as a comment before by Livio around the communication strategy that you have to have in crisis situation is fundamental. So what I've seen done really well is having joint communication strategy, creating welcome centers where people didn't have to go around and look for the information because most likely they had lost every reference, but the industry corralled together to provide the information, to provide the emergency kit, to provide the next steps. What I believe will be tremendously powerful, and it's proven in the last couple of years, is social media. So we can do a lot of outreach, not just in, but furnishing the information. There was a question around prevention. What can we do with prevention? What we're working a lot now on is alerts, emergency calls before things happen. I see a lot of insurance companies developing emergency systems so they can reach out to their insured before disaster strikes and let them know, this is coming. Do you have anything and everything available? This is where you should move for your first emergency call, and so on and so forth. So even if the industry does not have all the answers, I think that they realize that the best that they can do is to be close and to be the center where the answers can be provided and dispatched. I've seen companies where the insurance was not their own insured, working actually as a dispatch center of the call to the right next receiving center. It could have been an element of government, it could have been an NGO. So there is a sense of, that's I think where the community really is expressed very vividly. But I don't know, maybe my colleagues have other examples.
Thank you, Veronica. We have to close. Very, very short from Idar.
No, I just wanted to add that NGOs play an important role as partners for the insurance industry. Nature Conservancy, working in Mexico, the Red Cross, the Norwegian Refugee Council, people that have feet on the ground, close to the issues, and they are a very helpful resource. In addition, we have seen the development now of micro-insurance on the back of the microcredit development, and we are trying to develop that and also use then micro-insurance facilities and institutions close to the people. So, as Veronica says, some you will see direct contact, but you will also see contact through people that are locally active and that know the place where we try to get across.
Thank you, Idar. We are a little late, so I will avoid the closing remarks, but we understood today that the insurance sector can play really an important role as an absorber of risk and provider of risk expertise. The panel of today was a contribution because that's very useful for sharing the knowledge and increasing the awareness. Thanks to the panelists. Now it's time for the coffee break. Thank you very much. Bye.